Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Hello and welcome to another episode of our study in the key chapters of the Bible. Today we're turning to 1 Samuel chapter 31. This is the last chapter in the book of 1 Samuel, and it's also the final chapter in Saul's life. Now this is a heavy chapter, but I think it's got some stuff that's good for us to think about. When I was 18 or 19 years old, I was going to a small group, and our small group leader asked us one of the most memorable and really potentially one of the most life-changing questions that I've ever been asked. He asked us to write down our own obituary. He gave us a few minutes to write it out, kind of like it was in a newspaper, and then we had to read it to everyone in the rest of the group. And so he said our obituary had to include things like how old you want to be when you pass away, what will you have accomplished in your life, maybe who will you be married to, or how many kids will you have, how you've died. And he just wanted us to think through, how do we want to be remembered? What do we want people to say about us when we eventually step into eternity? Well, that little 10-minute exercise was one of the most powerful things I had ever done. In fact, in many ways, I am still following the basic gist of living that I wrote down on that day. And I start with that story because today's passage and yesterday's passage gives us something of an obituary on the life of Saul, really in many ways. The second half of the book of 1 Samuel is really an obituary on the life of Saul. His life is painful. His life is frightening. His life serves as a warning for us in our own lives as well. And so as we go to 1 Samuel 31, not only will we be talking about Saul, but our own lives as well. So as we go now to 1 Samuel chapter 31, just to put this whole passage in context here, Saul is about to fight against the Philistines, and you'll remember from yesterday when we looked at 1 Samuel 28, Saul is just terrified. David seems like he's joining with the Philistines, and he doesn't know what to do. And so he goes and seeks counsel from the witch of Endor, basically going and seeking counsel from a demon. Now he was trying to seek it from Samuel, but still he's completely sinning against the Lord in doing that. And he finds out in that chapter that this is going to be his final day on earth. And so with something of just a bitter heart, he goes in this battle against the Philistines. So verse 1 starts on off, and it's not the most auspicious beginning. The Philistines are fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel have either fled or they're killed. In verse 2, the Philistines overtake Saul and his sons. Tragically, Jonathan and his brothers are killed. And then in verse 3, Saul is hit by an arrow. He knows this is going to be now a serious situation. He's got this serious wound. So he calls upon his armor bearer in verse 4 to finish him off. The armor bearer refuses. And so Saul falls upon his own sword. When the armor bearer sees what's happened to Saul, he falls on his own sword too, and he dies. Then in verse 7, you've got this total disarray of the Israeli fighters. They're just terrified. They flee. They abandon the cities of that region. And it says that the Philistines go on in and begin to occupy them. And so then at the end of this chapter, the Philistines come down and they take Saul's body. They hang his armor in the temple of Asherah, who is the goddess of fertility. And that was probably just a way to thank her for the victory. And they hang Saul's body on the wall. And as this chapter closes, and ultimately as this whole book closes, the men of Jabesh-gilead, they go on out, they get Saul's corpse, they get his son's corpses, they bring him on back, and they burn them. And so that's our passage today. And it's not the most chipper, happy passage. And so that's why I think it's maybe a good exercise for us to think about our own life. And what do we want said about us when we enter into eternity? Saul's obituary would be a record of one squandered opportunity after another, or one act of defiance after another that ends with this ultimate act of defiance where he takes his own life. Now, Saul probably felt justified in taking his own life. After all, it's a bad situation. We'll all admit that. But this is really just one final act of cowardice. You'll remember back in chapter 28:15, or if you don't remember, you can just go ahead and turn there. Saul's with the witch at Endor, and he tells Samuel that the Lord has forsaken him. You can just hear the anguish in his voice, and my heart and my sympathies go out to Saul. I really know what this sounds like because I've heard this in my own voice, in my own pain. What Saul needs to know, that although his situation is really not looking good, and in a sense it is his own doing, it still can change. He is still serving a God of unlimited power and resources, and he needs to trust the Lord. Again, I'll admit the situation looks bleak, and no doubt Saul does feel as though God has forsaken him in this battle. But Saul needs to know, and we need to remember, who moved. It wasn't the Lord who moved. It wasn't the Lord who forsook Saul. It was Saul who forsook the Lord. Saul has been on this slow march away from God all along. He doubted God when he was first called to be king. He was afraid. And then once he becomes king, the power goes to his head and he starts acting like he can do no wrong, and he starts taking matters in his own hands, and he's just further rebelling and sinning against the Lord. And then in chapter 22, he kills the entire priesthood that's stationed in the city of Nob. All along, it wasn't the Lord who forsook Saul. It was Saul who forsook the Lord. But Saul still could repent. Saul still could call upon the Lord. This act of suicide is one final act of anger and defiance against God. In our own life, when it feels like the Lord is distant to us or when he's abandoned us, we need to know that he will never leave us or forsake us. And if it feels like he has, we need to go back and look where we got off the path. Where did we abandon him? Again, let's think about Saul's life. Again, this idea of an obituary here. When he was called to be king, he was afraid. What was that? It was this hyper focus on himself. His fear was really a doubt in God and a doubt in God's presence, a doubt in God's provision. His whole trust was in himself. He was essentially thinking it's all up to him. And since he didn't think he could do it, he was fearful. That was really just the initial baby step away from God down this path of despair. Later on in chapter 13, when Saul offered that unholy sacrifice to the Lord, remember the people were leaving, Saul wasn't there, so he just takes matters into his own hands. Again, Saul is fearful of people. He's not trusting God. He really shows that his whole goal wasn't to serve God and establish God's kingdom. It was just really trying to use God to achieve what Saul wanted. He was really just using God as a genie. Lord, give me my 3 wishes, or let me carry you like a rabbit's foot around in my back pocket just so I know that you're with me, that I'm good. I've got this good luck charm. But that's not what it means to serve God. Saul didn't understand this, that God is not our genie who's just here to do what we want. When we are restored to God through the cross of Christ, it's not a restoration so that we can now get God working for us. It's a restoration to repent and return to a place of obedience to him where we're seeking to serve him and glorify him. Saul's rabbit foot religion here is just another step down this path of despair. And think about it, even going back to that one event, in chapter 13, Saul was afraid. In chapter 14, it was his son, Jonathan, who so trusts the Lord that he and his armor bearer go on and take on the entire Philistine army, and the Lord fights for them and they win. So you can see, Jonathan trusted the Lord. Saul was on this path of despair. Likewise, when Saul disobeyed the Lord's command to annihilate the Amalekites, that was Saul putting himself in the seat of judgment on God's ways. Effectively, Saul was saying, Lord, I think you're wrong. I think I can improve upon what you want. And so Saul takes matters into his own hands. And in doing so, he's further walking down this path of despair. Later on in 1 Samuel 16, when Saul was fearful to go out and fight Goliath, again, his whole focus is on himself. He is doubting God. He's forgetting or doubting God's provisions. Deep down, again, he's thinking it's all up to him. So he can't take on Goliath. He's too afraid. And so a shepherd boy has to do the king's work. And even though the Lord saved Israel that day, Saul himself continues down this path of despair. The same could be said for his hatred of David. He just wasn't willing to submit to God's judgment. Now, at this point, he's lost the kingdom, but he still could have repented. He still could have ended his final years of life still in direct service to God, but he doesn't. The same could be said for his killing of the priests in chapter 22. Now, he does that out of retaliation to David because they were helping David, but that makes no sense. How much of this was just anger against God because Samuel had told him back in chapter 15 that God had taken the kingdom from him and given it to someone better. Obviously, these priests represent God, and this was probably, in part, Saul's way of getting back at God. But in doing so, Saul is now cruising down this path of despair. Perhaps this is most clearly seen in yesterday's account when Saul visits the witch at Endor. Again, this is this bizarre account of God's king going to a demonic source for counsel. He's obviously burned for it. And all that brings us now to our passage today. This is the pinnacle of his rebellion against God. He is so bitter against God for all that has happened. Rather than face life and whatever's going to come, rather than trust that God will give him the grace he needs to face whatever God has allowed, rather than repent, he literally dives headlong into his final act of rebellion. This isn't a time for Saul to fall on his sword. It's a time for Saul to fall before the Lord. This is a time for him to recognize the failure of the path that he has been on, and that all along God has been the rock. He's the one who has been there to support and watch over and protect and work among his people, and that Saul all along has been violating God's plan and will and rebelling against God. He needs to repent and call out to the Lord for mercy and forgiveness and truly surrender to Him and truly ask for God's grace to now bring him back to the path and put him on the path and lead him down the path of total trust and obedience to Him. But Saul doesn't do this. And look at the impact that Saul's suicide has on those around him. This final act of rebellion just further hurts the people around him. Look what happens to Saul's armor bearer in verse 5. He kills himself too. Now, remember that an armor bearer back then was one of the most trusted people. They're like family. They're the most loyal ones. They're the ones that will live and die for one another. And here you have Saul's suicide, leading to his armor bearer's suicide, to the death of a friend, a near family member-like person. Suicide is often considered or classified as a contagion. It affects all the people nearby, especially those who are closest to us, our family, our children, our friends. And you see that right here in this passage. And so the armor bearer sees Saul's loss of faith, his despair, and he loses his faith and has despair too. And so he commits suicide. He didn't have to. He could have escaped. He could have fought. He could have seen the Lord watch over him the way he watched over Jonathan and Jonathan's armor bearer, but he doesn't. Instead, he takes the coward's way out and he dies as well. Suicide is an act of selfishness that hurts everyone around us. It is a permanent act for a temporary problem, especially because God's grace is always available to those who call upon Him and seek Him. Think about the grace that Saul saw in other people's lives. He saw God strengthen His own son in the battle against the Philistines. What could the Lord have done with Saul in this situation? It would have been so amazing to see just Saul trust the Lord and the Lord do something incredible. He saw God's grace strengthen a young David as he fought Goliath. Couldn't the Lord do that with Saul too? He saw God's grace bless David in all of his battles and even bless David with the people. The reason that Saul doesn't see God's grace working in his life is because Saul is on this path of rebellion going away from the Lord. Compare Saul's response here in chapter 31 to David in chapter 30. Now, we didn't read this chapter, but chapter 30, verse 6 gives us an account where David responds to another dire, life-threatening situation. In chapter 30, the Amalekites, and these are the very Amalekites that Saul was supposed to have defeated back in chapter 15, and he claimed he did. These Amalekites come into the village where David is staying with he and his family, his soldiers, and they're all there, but David and the men are gone. And the Amalekites ransack the town, and they take all the women, the children, all this stuff. And so when David and his men come back and see what's happened, the other people were so angry at David and so bitter and blaming of him, they sought to kill him. And yet in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, it says, David strengthened himself in the Lord. Now, it doesn't tell us all that went into that, but I'm sure he prayed. I'm sure he submitted to the Lord. I'm sure he sought God's wisdom in all this. I'm sure he determined to obey God and please God rather than himself or other people. And God honored him, and God rescued him, and God rescued their families as well. And so here we see just recently, so to speak, just a chapter before, David is trusting God in a despairing situation and finds God's grace and help. And here, Saul, not a good situation, but not trusting the Lord. And he takes this final step of despair that he's going to be forever remembered by. And so as we just kind of wrap up here, again, kind of a heavy chapter, but hopefully one that's encouraging for us to see that we can trust God. We don't have to go down this route. There are reasons why Saul has got to this place, and we can, if we're on that same place, we can repent and find God's grace and help and transformation, and we could be the David back in chapter 30, the David who goes and meets with God, who meets with him for hours or days, whatever it takes to find God's grace and help and strength and wisdom. And we could be living an entirely different path than the one that we might be on as we repent and get back to God's path. Saul doesn't do that, and it's tragic. So here's just a final exercise for us to think about. Again, we've gone over Saul's life in detail today. Let's think about our own life. I'm sure that everyone who is listening to this doesn't want to be on Saul's path. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast, certainly not all the way to this very end right here. So I'm assuming that you want to be on God's path, the path of faith and obedience, where you're seeing His grace work in your life. So first, why don't you just examine your life before the Lord and ask Him to put you on that path or keep you on that path of total trust and reliance and obedience to Him. And if you're not, just take this opportunity to repent and just give yourself to the Lord and ask Him for the grace to just bring you back to the place of obedience to Him. And second, assuming that you are on this path of total trust and obedience to the Lord, why not take a couple minutes and write out the obituary that you'd like to have? Again, I don't mean to be creepy, but what kind of life do you want to live? Or where do you want to be in 5, 10, 20, 50 years from now? And even what changes do you need to make on your path so that you're on the path that you see God calling you to? And finally, of course, submit that whole thing to the Lord. because we don't want to demand, God, make this happen. We just want to submit ourselves to Him and be wise in numbering our days and thinking about our lives. And so with that, I'll leave you to your thoughts and your prayers to the Lord. Look forward to catching up with you tomorrow as we go now to 2 Samuel chapter 5, when David becomes king. We'll see you then. Have a great day, and God bless.